Hello, my name is Dawn Jordan, and I'm the Director of the Division of Regional and City Planning at the University of Oklahoma. I study the impacts of climate change on vulnerable populations. Today, I would like to spend my time with you talking about how climate change is going to impact people, particularly those who are vulnerable. For example, those who live next to low-lying coastal lands are vulnerable to sea level rise. My research concerns itself with those who are vulnerable because of their social, economic, and political statuses. This might include the poor or those living at the economic margins. These groups are particularly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change because they are fully exposed to the impacts of such changes. When these changes occur, those who are socially and economically stressed have a difficult time coping or adapting to such changes. The degree of vulnerability can be measured, though it's not an absolute concept. The truth is, everyone is vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. Defining who is and is not vulnerable to climate change is part of a political and social process. In the end, the distinguishing characteristic is the degree of adaptability of these vulnerable populations. In the IPCC report, a measure was established for understanding the dimensions of climate vulnerability. Vulnerability is a function of exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity. Exposure is the degree of climate stress faced by a particular group. For example, we might define exposure as the magnitude and frequency of events. Farmers invariably will be exposed to the consequences of drought over time. The second factor considered when measuring vulnerability is sensitivity. Sensitivity is the degree to which a system will respond, either positively or negatively, to a change in climate. For instance, arid regions of Oklahoma are prone to drought conditions. Climate predictions indicate the possibility that droughts will be punctuated by flooding as the climate changes in Oklahoma. Many scientists and farmers alike are concerned about the ability of the natural environment to respond to flooding after extensive periods of drought. Will the earth be able to absorb some of the precipitation, or will it all be carried away, moving valuable topsoil with it? The final variable considered when attempting to measure vulnerability is adaptive capacity. This is the capacity of a system to adjust in response to actual or expected climate stimuli, their effects or impacts. To carry our hypothetical further, will farmers be able to adapt to the drought-flood cycle? Perhaps they will begin to consider planting crops that can respond to these environmental changes. The concept of vulnerability is often interpreted in two ways. In the first, the ability of people and systems to adapt defines what and who is vulnerable. By contrast, others believe that vulnerability, rather than adaptability, needs to be the starting place for analysis. The difference between these interpretations is significant. I offer the following examples to illustrate the differences in approaches. In the first instance, we begin with an analysis of the kind of adaptation that will have to occur to ensure the long-term viability of people to continue living in a place affected by climate change. After considering the adaptation needed, we look to see if the people are capable of the same. In 2012, I worked on a project with colleagues at the University of Florida to understand the impact of sea level rise on those living in an area on the northeastern coast of Florida. We projected sea level rise and how it would affect the natural and built environment. It was clear that the impacts would be significant. We began exploring the types of adaptations that would need to occur for activity to continue in these affected regions. Everything from the construction of heavy infrastructure to stave off the water to the relocation of people from this area. After proposing the adaptation strategies, we began to look at the social, political, and economic context of the place to see at what degree each of these strategies was feasible. In the case of areas of wealth, heavy infrastructure at the community and individual level was much more feasible than it would have been in areas of poverty. Let's contrast the first interpretation, focusing on adaptation, to the second, which focuses on vulnerability. I offer the following example from my own work. In 2015, my colleagues and I worked with Integra Realty Resources to conduct the statewide affordable housing market study. As a part of this study, we measure the social vulnerability of Oklahoma residents by census tract. We looked at features like income, rental rates, age, employment, education, race, and housing type. These factors helped us determine the social vulnerability of residents living in each census tract in the state of Oklahoma. We did this analysis to bring to the attention of local, state, and federal governments the need for assistance in the case of tornadic activities. Most of the people in these areas do not have access to private storm shelters. Some do not speak English or have access to important weather information. Some do not have vehicles to transport them away from danger. Some may not have insurance to cover the cost of rebuilding post-storm. As such, these census tracts are highly vulnerable. To enhance adaptability, our approach demonstrated the need to understand the social, economic, and political realities associated with vulnerability. Why is this difference critical? From a planning perspective, we need to understand how important it is to appreciate the needs of our most vulnerable residents and to make decisions that appreciate the ability of all residents to adapt to the current and future effects of climate change.